Well, good afternoon, and thanks for staying with us. Monte here with the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association once again, and it's my job to moderate a perennial favorite, the policy panel. For the first time, we're mixing it up a bit this year, and we're not going to cover just federal policy, but we're going to cover state policy as well. So first, we have Geoff Cooper back on the stage here with the Renewable Fuels Association. Our other federal expert is Kovarik, Vice President of Federal Affairs for Clean Fuels Alliance America. I won't do this next year, it'll be enough time, but for this year I'll say Clean Fuels, or as I like to say, the artist formerly known as National Biodiesel Board. Kurt has more than 20 years of doing all things renewable fuels for Senator Chuck Grassley prior to joining Clean Fuels. Next up, we've got Jake Swanson, who is president of High Yield Strategies, a government affairs consulting firm specializing in agriculture, energy, and in economic work. But until recently, Jake, as was mentioned this morning, was a policy advisor to Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds, where he helped shepherd groundbreaking state renewable fuels policy into law. And then finally, we have Brian Werner, Executive Director of the Minnesota Biofuels Association. A native of Minnesota, Brian worked in D.C., probably for longer than he'd care to admit, but most recently for biofuels champion Senator Amy Klobuchar from the state of Minnesota. And then he's returned home now to head up the Minnesota Biofuels Association. So that's our experts, and right now I would say that we live at a time where American politics can best be described as interesting. Polarization and tribalism in politics has impacted both state and federal policymaking, but in the face of this, historically, renewable fuels have typically been bipartisan, both the support, which is good, and the opposition, which is a little more tricky. So where does that leave us? I don't know, but we're about to find out. So with that, I'm going to kick it off here with Geoff. Geoff, Republicans eked out a narrow majority in the U.S. House, but fell short of retaking the U.S. Senate. So given that split control, how will the next 2 years differ from the last 2 years where the Democrats had what is oftentimes in D.C. called the trifecta with both houses and the White House?
Well, thanks, Monte. And I guess I would say if the first few weeks of the 118th Congress are any indication, we're in for a rocky ride the next few years. I think Congress and the House especially set pretty low expectations for the new Congress. It took, I'm sure as everyone's aware, 15 votes for the House to agree on a speaker. We're now in the middle of a debt ceiling fight. So I think all the early signs we're already seeing are around dysfunction and gridlock. As you said, we've got split control in Congress. We've got a Democratic Senate, Republican House. It's hard for me to see any meaningful big-ticket legislation that we would care about moving across the goal line in that kind of environment. And that can cut both ways. I think in many ways a Congress that does nothing can be helpful to our industry sometimes. And obviously when you're playing defense on certain legislative priorities, like the renewable fuel standard, for instance. Having that kind of gridlock can be useful in preventing mischief. And so, I think we don't have high hopes for much meaningful legislation for the renewable fuels industry, and certainly not like what we saw the last 2 years where Democrats did have control. They were able to use budget reconciliation to get things like the Inflation Reduction Act done. We don't expect to see much of that in the next 2 years.
Okay. Any thoughts? Everybody agrees?
I would tend to agree. I've told my members, if you're trying to get something enacted this year, good luck. But if you're trying to maintain status quo on a successful policy, you can feel pretty good about it. This Congress is unlikely to do much good or much harm.
Okay. So, Kurt, for the first time, I think, since either of us has been involved, which is longer than I care to admit, Iowa does not have a member of Congress that is of the same party as the administration and the president. So putting on your former Hill staff hat, how does that impact Iowa's ability to influence the White House agency decisions? And do you have any advice for folks like me and the members out here on how we can be impactful?
That's a good question. I think it does have an impact, but probably less than you might think, and there's a couple reasons why. First, biofuels has always been bipartisan. There's always a bipartisan delegation from the Midwest or coastal states that come together to defend biofuels. Secondly, I think particularly in Iowa, you have a delegation that's well respected for criticizing administrations of both stripes. And because they do it when there's a Republican in the White House, as they did when we had the previous administration, they have a lot more credibility when they do it when there's a Democrat in the White House. And finally, I would say this, never discount the ability of a partisan attack to elevate the other side to have to in some way respond. And what I mean by that is you might have, a Republican delegation from Iowa criticizing a Democratic president, but there's a lot of Democrat senators and representatives who, when they see that, they have to respond, and they're going to come and they're going to demand their meeting at the White House to make sure their message gets heard. So don't ever take your foot off the gas when it comes to advocacy with your delegation here in Iowa. They're obviously one of the best and most effective, so regardless of who's in the White House.
Okay. Well, Brian, you were also a Hill staffer out there. Anything you would add?
No, I mean, I think that's generally correct, and I think Kurt hit the nail on the head with that. So.
Okay.
And be nice to the staff. Can't understate that enough.
I try. So, Brian, now that you're back in Minnesota, I believe that you have a DFL trifecta. So first you can explain to the crowd what the DFL is up there in Minnesota. And I think you told me, and if I got this wrong, correct me, but so not only does the DFL control the House, the Senate, and the governorship, but all of your biofuels plants happen to be in districts that are not represented by a DFL member. That has got to impact, at least somewhat, your ability to make progress on biofuels policy. So how are you trying to deal with that up there? And welcome home. That's a great way to come back.
Thank you. I mean, I definitely noticed the Prince reference you made earlier, so appreciate that, and thanks for having us down. Yeah, it's a significant challenge. The first thing I did when I started this job was I went through the list of legislators in the Minnesota State House and Senate and said, I'm going to go in and I'm going to meet with everyone that has a ethanol plant in their district, and started going through the list, got down further through the list, not a single Democrat, which in Minnesota we call our Democrats call themselves the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, DFL for short. So, but yeah, it's a significant challenge, and so that just I think is as I've been doing more meetings with DFL members in the House and the Senate, it's just there's a lot of educational component that goes into that. A lot of just ethanol 101. It's made from corn. I mean, it's unfortunately that's kind of you're starting from square one. So it's been a challenge, but it's been also an opportunity to go in and really break down some of those myths. I think it's going in and really making sure that some of the main messages that we get across, the 50% reduction in GHGs, the net zero pledges that a lot of the members have made by 2050, it's getting that message out. And actually just this last week, we had the chair and the vice chair of the Senate Agriculture Committee came out to one of our plants, Heartland Corn Products in Winthrop, and we did a full tour, went through the entire process of how ethanol is made, talked through the jobs that are created in rural Minnesota because of it, and you could see by the end of the tour, it was starting to sink in. You could tell that the legislators were starting to understand how important the industry is in rural Minnesota and for reducing transportation emissions. And so, we have our work cut out for us, but we're ready to put the work in and really do that education piece.
Okay, great. Jake, you served on the inside of governor's office. You already said be nice to staff, so you kind of led me into this next question, but what is something that you can share with our audience? Because we oftentimes ask these people, call your legislator, email your legislature, come down to the Capitol, have a meeting, invite them out to your plant. What could we do to maybe improve our ability to lobby our elected officials? Something that we don't do that we should, maybe something that we do that we shouldn't? Any insights would be great.
Yeah, well, first of all, Monte, thanks for having me. After working in Governor Reynolds' office for the last 3 years, I have some ideas. First of all, I think some of the best lobbying occurs before you ever step foot in the halls of a Capitol building. Before a legislative session, it is imperative to invite these legislators to your plants, to your farms, to your places of business, and do not take anything for granted. And I'm sure Brian shares this too. You would be surprised, even though we live in the state of Iowa, there may be some legislators that think ethanol is made from popcorn. It is not. And then when you are entering the halls of a Capitol building to talk to legislators about legislation, they can put things into context when they've already, been able to have the opportunity to visit with you, tour your plants, farms, businesses. So I can't overstate that enough, how important it is to get in touch long before you ever need to lobby them on a particular issue. And then when you are visiting with them or their staff, be honest and be pleasant. Be honest and be pleasant. You do not need to yell at anybody.
How do you spell pleasant?
Yeah.
Pleasant. I got to write that down.
So just keep that in mind. That'd be my words of wisdom as we're, entering our legislative session here in Iowa.
All right. Well, cool. Geoff, before we switch and look forward, I wanted to take a quick chance to look back. The original RFS expanded in RFS 2, if you will, in 2007, had this upward slope to 15 billion gallons of conventional biofuels, and of course advanced in cellulosic on top of that. But we were supposed to hit 15 billion in like 14, I think it was, maybe it was 15.
Yep.
And by hook or by crook, through various administrations of both parties, that's never happened. But I believe we just came out of a year, 2022, when the RFS was set, the conventional level of the RFS was set at 15 billion gallons.
Right.
And where they didn't let a bunch out the back or cut a bunch off the top. So unless somebody reopens that, should we take a moment to celebrate 2022 as the first year ever that obligated parties will actually have to submit 15 billion RINs?
Yes, we should. And I think that is worth a round of applause. But I will say that
we have so many challenges. Sometimes we don't stop to smell the roses.
That's right. And there is a caveat. Refiners have not demonstrated compliance yet. That deadline hasn't come. So, there's always opportunities for mischief. But yes, we fully expect that 2022, the last year of the congressionally specified schedule of the RFS, was the first year that EPA actually enforced the 15 billion gallon requirement. You got to go all the way back to 2013.
Yep.
That was the last time that EPA actually enforced the conventional biofuel volume that was in the statute. So, yeah, it's been a long time coming. It feels a little bit like celebrating when your son or daughter picks up their room or does the dishes without being asked, because it's like, well, you should do that. But yeah, I think it is something that's worth celebrating.
All right. Well, Kurt, looking at the future now, we have an RFS rule out for public comment right now to set the annual volume levels. You guys would call those RVOs. I'll call them RFS blending levels for our audience here today. But the proposal from EPA does not seem to match for advanced biofuels and biodiesel and renewable diesel specifically what our own Energy Information Administration is saying. And I don't mean it's just a little off. I mean it's a lot off. And it's not growing over the 3 years of this draft rule. I guess, and I think the public comment period is coming to a close on Friday. So when I pop in there into the portal and I pull down your comments, what am I going to see Clean Fuels say about that?
Yeah, appreciate that. Let me just give a little bit of background on the biomass-based diesel industry and what the RFS has meant, because I know a lot of folks, tend to focus heavily on ethanol and maybe don't think about biomass-based diesel to the same extent. So when the RFS was first enacted in 2005, our industry was probably 100 or 200 million gallons. So that's a couple of small biodiesel plants. In 2022, our market was 3.1 billion. We're about 5% of the market. Today, our feedstocks are about 50% veg oils, but 50% truly waste oils. Think of animal fats, used cooking oil, and distillers corn oil, adding value throughout that whole agriculture sector. As you mentioned, Monte, we've got a lot of exciting new things happening in our industry. A lot of new entrants are looking to biomass-based diesel as a way to both diversify energy supply for our country and lower their carbon emissions, which it's exciting if you're a soybean farmer. It's a little bit unnerving if you're a biodiesel producer and you want to know what this looks like going forward. So to give you an idea, level set where we are, I think I said our market last year was 3.1 billion gallons. We looked at the EPA set proposal as a real opportunity to set multiple years of growth, and EPA did exactly the opposite. They actually set the volumes for all 3 years of 23, 24, and 25 below our last year's market, okay? So this was a program that was implemented by Congress to set the signal for market growth, force, a market forcing mechanism, and EPA, for whatever reason, set average increased volumes of 65 million gallons over the next 3 years. And as you mentioned, EIA, the government's owned energy data collection agency, predicts that we'll have 600 million additional gallons of capacity this year and about 850 million additional gallons next year. So our message to EPA, and I'm sorry I'm taking a long time, but I
was trying to do math in my
I want to
head.
make
That's
sure
why I had the funny.
I want to make sure biodiesel gets equal time on the stage today, so I've got a lot to make up for. Our message to EPA is, listen, if you send the signals of growth to an industry, what do you get? You get about 20 announcements of soybean crush facilities throughout the upper Midwest to supply protein to animals, but oil to biomass-based diesel. You get extreme carbon reductions, 75% better than petroleum diesel on average. What don't you get? You're not going to get sustainable aviation fuel. You're not going to get build out of these crush facilities. You're not going to get expansion of low carbon fuels. So there's a lot at stake. The public comment period ends on Friday, as you mentioned. So our goal is to impress upon EPA, USDA, the Biden administration, that they need to course correct before they finalize this rule in June.
Speaking of that, can you send me over an early copy of yours so I can cut and paste? Because with this conference and the timing of the rule,
I strongly believe we all have to do our own work, Monte.
imitation is the highest form of flattery. Now, Geoff, just briefly, do you want to comment on the conventional level
Right.
that's in this draft rule?
Yeah, as I mentioned this morning, EPA proposed a 15 billion gallon requirement for 2023, in addition to another 250 million gallons of that court-ordered remanded volume, so 15.25 total, and then 15.25 for both 2024 and 2025. And it wasn't too long ago. I remember coming to conferences like this 4 or 5 years ago and talking about what happens to the RFS after 2022. People were gravely worried about what happens when you give EPA the keys to the kingdom and they have the latitude to write these volumes. There was a lot of fear about, well, do the volumes go backward? So we advocated vociferously with EPA over the last 4 or 5 years to just ensure that the volumes beyond 2022 continue to grow. So, and EPA did that with its proposal, at least for conventional biofuels. Now, their volumes for advanced and biomass-based diesel also grow beyond the 2022 levels, but certainly not to the extent that I know the marketplace expects, production and capacity to go. So we were happy overall with the conventional volumes. I believe there's probably some room to grow the total and the advanced and biodiesel volumes.
Okay. So Brian, turning back to the state a little bit, I think there's an effort for a low carbon fuel standard in Minnesota. We've seen those out on the West Coast, talk on the East Coast. But I've heard even in Minnesota, which I think of as a Midwest rural ag state, I've heard that there's some groups more or less trying to cook the books or put their finger on the scale against ethanol, not counting CO2 reductions or adding bogus carbon penalties. Can you update us with what's going on in Minnesota and where do you see that going?
Of course. Yeah, so Minnesota Biofuels Association is part of a larger coalition of groups, both environmental groups and agriculture groups that are working to try to put together some language that works for all sides. And so we've been working on that for a couple of years now, but unfortunately, the makeup of the Minnesota House of Representatives right now is such that in order to get a bill through the House there have been a lot of amendments that were proposed to the legislation from last session in 2022 that really did disadvantage not just biofuel producers, but also farmers in general. There was an amendment to include nitrate runoff into the life cycle assessment, and that was an amendment proposed in the legislation. And so, I think we certainly see the value of an LCFS. I think we've all seen the value of an LCFS with a lot of the markets in the Pacific, with California, Oregon, Washington State. But I think we all have also seen that LCFS policy is very complicated. You probably see the amount of notices that come out of CARB on a monthly basis, and understand it's a delicate balance to get it right. And a lot of times there's a lot of details that need to be worked through in the implementation through the regulatory agencies, that I think we would say, let's get those details, let's get them in the statute so that we have the certainty to know what we're expecting with an LCFS going forward. So it is something that we're continually working on, but I think some of the proposals that we've seen cause great concern as far as restricting credit generation from CCS, and making the MPCA, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, the sole the sole regulatory agency. It's certainly something that gives us a lot of concern, but we want to be at the table. We want to make sure that we get the details correct and that we find something that works for both Minnesota producers, but also for farmers as well.
When you get that bill signed and across the finish line, it'll make it that much sweeter because of it.
Yeah, so speaking of sweeter, I saw some jealous eyes when they saw me walk up here with a Mountain Dew, because as near as I can tell, this is a Coke facility and you can't find a Mountain Dew within about 2.3 miles of this place, because I've looked. So I'm a strong believer in beverage choice. I'm also a strong believer in fuel choice. So Jake, we invited you here, well, you're a handsome guy, but also to take a victory lap. After 2 years of effort, you put in a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, obviously with our governor's leadership. But having been a former staffer, I appreciate the work that goes on behind the scenes to push across what might be the first time that I would argue Iowa's taken Minnesota, but the first time that Iowa's taken a leadership position, a true leadership position across the board in biofuels policy. We've always been a leading producer, but now we're a leading producer and policy maker. So I would like you to just talk a little bit about what we did for fuel choice here for higher blends, and we'll talk about various aspects of the bill throughout the panel. So why don't we start this one with the first of a kind E15 access standard that we're able to get through.
Sure. Well, Minnesota maybe beat us with an E10 standard, so they walked so that we could run. But, we had an exciting last couple of years in the governor's office, but that bill would not have been possible without the strong, unified support and advocacy from everybody in this room. It was a team effort, no doubt about it, and I was honored to be a part of it. And it started with forming a strong coalition. We had advocates from every step of the fuel supply chain pushing in the same direction for this legislation. And I can tell you there was nothing better than seeing Governor Kim Reynolds sign that bill into law last May. Just a huge, huge accomplishment for the state. That was a big deal, and it's a good bill. We are able to dramatically expand access to higher blends of ethanol and biodiesel, and with the stroke of a pen, expanded access in the greatest way to higher blends of renewable fuels. So now Iowans have access to a lower cost, cleaner burning fuel that's better for the environment, better for energy independence, better for national security, better for pocketbooks. I got 2 small kids. I'm all about E15, so that way we can afford other things too. And Iowans deserve access to a lower cost fuel. And so that's what that bill meant for the state of Iowa. And I'm excited to hear about other states, Minnesota, Nebraska, and others that are using our legislation to write their own bills. And hopefully we can see those signed into law here in the next couple of years, or maybe even this year. That's really exciting. And that's what it means to be a leader in renewable fuels. And I'm so proud to have been a part of that effort here in Iowa.
Well, we just, on behalf of the IRFA members and others in this room, all the ag coalitions, corn, soybeans, Farm Bureau, we're all united. We had key partners from the retail industry, not all of them, but even some retailers who said, hey, this is the right thing for the state to do. And it still wouldn't have got done without your work behind the scenes and without the governor making it a priority. It's a lot easier to kill a bill than it is to pass a bill, I can assure you. And so with her leadership, that's what got it over its last few hurdles. And we are very excited. So over the next 3 years, the vast majority of Iowans are going to be able to pull up to almost any station that's out there and find E15. And, that's averaging 17 cents a gallon less. That's going to be great. And you think, well, yeah, but Iowa's not that big of a market. But you're right. We are going to try to export it. I'm giving Brian a year pass to get his feet under, and then I'm going to be up knocking on his door. But this year, Nebraska has introduced legislation. In fact, some of our friends from Nebraska can't be here today because they're actually having a legislative hearing today on the bill. That is not completely, but huge important chunks of it are literally cut and pasted from the Iowa legislation. And so that is what we've always wanted for Iowa, is to be a leader in policy, and then not just because it affects our relatively small fuel market, but because once we prove you can do it, prove it works, we can export it out there. So I just like everyone to give Jake a round of applause for what he accomplished. It's not common.
So I got to jump in now
Okay,
since
okay.
you called us out in Minnesota. So great work. Really appreciate all of the leadership on that. But I do want to point out that Minnesota does still have the highest blend rate of any state in the nation.
We're working on it. We'll get there.
Give us 3 years, man.
Yeah.
We're on your heels.
But no, I think showing those successes definitely puts other states, gives us that experience, gives us that sort of guide with which to work through. I think we have found some challenges in Minnesota with getting an E15 standard. The governor had a bill in 2021 that unfortunately was killed in the legislature. But I think we saw that it was attacked from all sides, and so whether it was from the right with folks who didn't like the mandate aspect of it, or folks from the left who just didn't want any ethanol higher blends, period. So I guess one way that we've been trying to go about it in Minnesota is to get more higher blend infrastructure out there into the marketplace through grants, through incentives. And so I think that's one way that we've been trying to go about it. We have a bill that we're working on right now with the Minnesota Petroleum Marketers Association called the Liquid Fuel Modernization Act, which would create a separate fund with the Department of Agriculture that would turn on and off, and it would provide reimbursements to retailers for installing that higher blend infrastructure. But certainly would love to get any more advice about your experience of getting that done.
Yeah, absolutely. Any state that's considering doing something like this, I mean, we've got some of the top experts here on this stage, I think, who can help any state or anybody that wants to write legislation. We've been there. We know what the challenges are. We know where the traps are. We know what the opposition says. We can get you through it.
So Geoff, switching back over to our federal side here, I didn't realize we were going to split everybody like this, so I have my state and federal. But we talked a little bit with Kurt, or I should say Kurt talked a little bit about the disconnect between what we think is the reality of biomass-based diesel production going forward and where the RFS draft rule puts it. There's been a lot of time. I think IRFA recently asked the EPA to provide more time to study and comment on this new eRINs program. So maybe not everybody in our audience has heard of eRINs, or even RINs for that matter. So could you maybe explain that briefly, and then tell us whether you think that what the EPA has rolled out here makes sense, and do they seem to have it matched up, right? Because while I love the fact that they went above 15 billion gallons in those last 2 years for the first time ever with the base conventional number, if a few billion eRINs come trickling down into that pool, or a few billion biomass-based diesel RINs come trickling down into that pool, that 15.25 isn't going to look so good. So could you talk a little bit about what RFA's positives and negatives are on that aspect of the RVO?
Yeah, well, and you asked several questions in there, but I'll try and break them out one at a time. But I think
You're a trained professional.
when you go back and look at what the law says about fuels that can qualify under the renewable fuel standard, there's really a few key criteria. One is it's got to be made from renewable biomass, and secondly, it needs to be used as a transportation fuel. And so Congress, early on, and then EPA very early on said, yeah, if you've got electricity that's made from biomass that is used as a transportation fuel, and the user can demonstrate that it was used as a transportation fuel, it should qualify for the RFS. It's taken them, years to actually get around to writing the rules that would implement electricity as a qualifying fuel under the RFS, and we're for the first time seeing their proposal to do that. And there are some facets of what EPA is proposing that give us some heartburn. And so what EPA is proposing for eRINs, electricity RINs, is that the generator of those RINs would not be the generator of the renewable fuel, but would rather be the automaker who makes the electric vehicle. And so, now you've got a situation where EPA is suggesting that automakers like Tesla, GM, Ford, whoever else is making EVs, would be the generator of these RIN credits, which is completely inconsistent with the way the RFS works for every other renewable fuel that is regulated under the program, whether it's biodiesel, renewable diesel, ethanol, biogas. In all those cases, the RIN generator is the fuel producer. And that makes sense because nobody is better qualified to know what quantity of fuel is generated and kind of the characteristics of that fuel than the fuel producer themselves. So we see some concerns with the way EPA is proposing this. We're also not exactly sure where they came up with the projected volumes of eRINs that they think will be available in the marketplace. And of course, that estimate is used to build the cellulosic biofuel requirement. So there's some concerns there and some issues. And if you look at the 800 pages of material that EPA put out in this proposal, about half of it is dedicated to this eRIN scheme and how that's all going to work. So we did ask EPA for more time to evaluate that portion of this proposal, along with our friends in the retail fuel sector. And we haven't heard back from EPA with the comment deadline on Friday. I think it's unlikely that they're going to grant that request. One other aspect that people should know about with eRINs is they get a multiplier, basically. And so what EPA does is they take an energy equivalent value for a gallon of ethanol, and they say if you make that same volume of BTUs from electricity, you get more than one RIN. In fact, you get something like 3.6 or 4 RINs, because the theory is that the drivetrain in an electric vehicle is 3 or 4 times more efficient than the drivetrain in an internal combustion engine. So that multiplier effect, I think, is also something we got to keep a really close eye on as EPA implements this. And then just very quickly, you talked about the trickle-down effect of the different categories under the RFS. That is a concern. If EPA doesn't set the total high enough, kind of the residual bucket that everything falls into is conventional biofuels. That's the D6 RIN pool. So if Kurt's guys go out and make way more biodiesel or way more renewable diesel than they have a standard for, then that can flow over into the conventional pool and could back out conventional gallons of corn ethanol or other conventional biofuels. Same could be said with cellulosic. So that's another reason that we support what these guys are asking for in terms of higher volumes.
And Monte, I would just echo a lot of the comments that Geoff made. I think they're spot on. And I think, as you look at the program, we've got an industry that's built on kind of maintaining the certainty and the verifiability of the program. And I think the foundational issue at stake here with eRINs is maintaining the integrity of the program to make sure that they're held to the same kind of rigorous verification regime that we are. And then with respect to volumes, we want to ensure that whatever comes online with respect to eRINs, it's not at the expense of our fuels or the conventional fuels or any backsliding in volumes, which is why it's critically important that EPA don't screw this up. I don't know how much confidence we have in this room within the EPA to do that, but we're hopeful that they can get it right at the end of the day so that we're not the ones left kind of holding the bag.
And just one more real quick comment. People have asked, well, why in the world would EPA make the auto manufacturer the RIN generator in this case? And the whole thought process, the whole rationale behind it is that the autos would share that value that they generate from RINs with consumers in the form of a discount or a lower price for the EV. And we've I'm not holding my breath on whether how much of that value is actually going to trickle down to the consumer. We've seen many other cases across many other policies where the value of that RINs or that credit stays in the pocket of the OEM and the consumer never sees any of it.
Yeah, and I just think I've shared this with some of our ag partners that, I mean, there is a farmer, it won't be exclusively, but there's a farmer aspect to this where it is farmers, dairies, things like that are in a position to create renewable natural gas that could generate these credits. And instead of being able to benefit directly from that and find a competitive market for that, they're almost, as I understand it, I'm trying to still read through the 800 pages, they're basically obligated to send them to a specific auto company and more or less transfer the value of that to them. And it's like, well, wait a minute, they're just taking more away from farmers. So it's, on that side, I might ask Kurt, you kind of got into this, but let's dig deeper. I've read somewhere that between the de-emphasis of advanced biofuels that this rule seems to propose, coupled with this e-RIN proposal with all these multipliers and different things, and moving the RINs to the automakers who do not use renewable biomass to make transportation fuel, which was the core tenet of the RFS to begin with, that some people are calling this the electrification of the RFS. Do you agree, or do you have any concerns or anything else on this area you want to touch on?
That might be a little premature. However, I would say, as you read through it, there's clearly a bias towards promotion of electric vehicles. It's not necessarily a whole rewrite of the RFS to be an EV mandate, but you can certainly see that there's a thumb on the scale to try to promote EVs penetration above kind of building out additional biofuels. And it's frustrating, as if you saw Geoff's remarks earlier this morning in the chart that you showed of the decarbonization of transportation. How many of those sectors of the economy are not going to be decarbonized through battery power or electrification? I mean, I like to tout about the biomass-based diesel industry. One of the things, the nicest feature about our industry is our fuel goes into transportation applications that are unlikely. I mean, can you imagine rail or shipping or aviation being electrified? It's impossible, not in my lifetime. But yet, rather than try to say, let's double down on that policy, well, let's just push forward as hard as we can on electrification. And there's a time value of carbon that should be considered in this decision making. The carbon that you can reduce today saves you. If you're electrifying in 10 years, you're adding 10 additional years of carbon in the atmosphere that compounds. So why aren't we saying, hey, we've got carbon solutions today that we can deploy. All we need to do is send the proper market signals, and we'll do it. I mean, that's one thing farmers are always committed to. You send the market signal, and they respond. The same is true of the biofuels industry. So Geoff was very pleasant in his remarks this morning about the administration and their view on biofuels. I'm a hair more skeptical, just because of all of the the singular focus on electrification.
No, that's right. I was talking to a gentleman in the trade show after lunch from South Korea, and he was talking about a professor over there that, we talk about decarbonization, and we actually need to do a better job of talking about the unique type of decarbonization that biofuels brings. He said if you think of, carbon filling up a bathtub, all right, so that water is rising, and what we're trying to do is keep the water from getting to the top and spilling over where it's bad for the climate and humanity. Okay, if you think of it like that, most of the decarbonization we're talking about from other sectors simply takes the knob of the water, the water faucet, and turns it down a little bit. But the water level is still rising. Biofuels, because what grows us, whether that's a soybean plant, whether that's a corn plant, whether that's algae, whatever it might be, they're taking CO2 that's already in the atmosphere, that's already been put up there probably by the use of fossil fuels in the past, sucking into that plant, and then when we capture it and put it back down underground where it started, we're actually not just turning the faucet down, we're pulling the plug and draining the bottom of the tub. That is worth way more than just slowing the rising level of the water. And I never thought of it that way before. I love visuals. I love that visual. I'm going to steal it. I hope it's not copyrighted because I'm stealing it. But it's really something that I think need to do a better job of talking about. We're not just slowing the increase of carbon. We're actually taking carbon and putting it back down and reversing it.
Yeah, I mean, we're recycling atmospheric carbon. We're recycling through biofuels carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And then in the instance of carbon capture and sequestration or soil carbon sequestration, things that are happening on the farm today where you're building, putting more carbon back into the soil, you are reducing the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere through those practices. And so it is different than a lot of the other things that we hear about, and we do need to do a better job of talking about that.
But let's not forget where those electric vehicle batteries are made. I mean, 80-90% are mined in China. We can produce ethanol and biodiesel right here, right in the Midwest, supporting our farmers, our rural economies, right here in Iowa for sure, but certainly in the Midwest as well, and right here in the United States where it should be.
Yeah, I remember when our dependence on foreign oil was considered a liability. Now we're saying, hey, let's be dependent upon foreign metals, foreign batteries, foreign...
It doesn't make any sense to trade that to China for electric vehicle battery supply chain dependence.
Well, I see our time is winding down. Don't worry, there's more of it than you want, but not more of it than I want. So I'm going to ask us to go into a little bit of a speed round mode. But maybe keep answers to a minute or so. Brian, I think you mentioned a grant program is your priority this year, or if not, can you tell us kind of what is your lots of little things, or I shouldn't say little bit, lots of things, but what would you say your number one priority is this year?
Yeah, it's getting those that biofuel infrastructure out there so that we can distribute higher blends to Minnesota consumers, because it's better for the environment, it's better for their pocketbooks.
Okay. We've had great success with that here, great return on investment. We might dig into that a little deeper, but I want to make sure we have time to talk about this, one of the second kind of Iowa firsts that we blew through last year with this legislation. We talked about the E15 access standard. Iowa also became, the governor signed into law, the very first incentive for retailers to sell blends over B20. And I'll admit, I thought that was kind of an aspirational, nice thing, but it wasn't going to be real impactful in the short term. But we're already hearing that major over-the-road truck stops, or as soon as it warms up a little bit more, we'll be selling B30. And so can you tell us a little bit about the biodiesel incentive side of the bill?
Yeah, absolutely. We were really excited to get that signed into law and to be the first state to offer a B30 retailer tax credit. So every time a fuel retailer in the state of Iowa sells a gallon of B30, that's a 10-cent tax credit in their pockets. We're really excited to be the first there. I haven't seen a lot of retailers doing it, but it's a relatively new tax credit, but I'm excited to see where it goes. And if we're going to be a leader in renewable fuel production here in Iowa, we should be a leader in renewable fuel policy as well. And so it was great to see that signed into law. I'm excited to see the impact that it has, and hopefully retailers are able to take advantage of that tax credit here in Iowa.
Okay, great. Geoff, you talked a little bit early on about it's not looking good for new legislation, but I know we've been working for several years to try to have some marker bills in place just in case the stars align. One of those, our Corn Friends support the Next Generation Fuels Act. Where do you see that going? We've got to get it reintroduced. Obviously, regardless of the policy, it might be tough, but can you talk a little bit about Next Gen?
Yeah, so the Next Generation Fuels Act is a policy that was introduced in the last Congress that we strongly support. It would establish a high-octane, low-carbon fuel requirement. But in addition to that, it would take care of a lot of other regulatory impediments that have been holding renewable fuels and specifically ethanol back in the marketplace. Things like the RVP issue for higher blends, things like certification issues when you talk about certifying new vehicles, infrastructure issues. So it is in one package kind of everything we would like to see Congress do to really create a new chapter for liquid fuels, more efficient, lower carbon liquid fuels moving forward. As I mentioned at the outset of this conversation, it's going to be difficult to get anything like that through this Congress, but we certainly are going to look for any opening, any opportunity we have to work with our friends in the corn world and lots of other supporters to try and get that bill into committee and get it moving.
Yeah, with the gridlock, it's hard to imagine it going through what you might call a traditional path, but you never know when some crisis in Congress's mind makes them go, hey, we need to do something. And then if we have something ready, you never know. So That's good. Kurt, I know you guys, we talked earlier and several different people about the game-changing tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. Given my limited time this morning, it was mainly on the ethanol side, but that act also extended out the biodiesel tax credit and then morphed it in with this more generic, supposedly technology neutral, clean fuels tax credit. I know you guys were about equity there. So talk a little bit about what you liked, didn't like through the extension, the change, equity, anything about that tax credit.
Sure. Yeah, it it really is a whole rewrite of clean energy tax incentives. So as most folks know, we've had a $1 per gallon blender's tax credit since about 2005. This bill extended that for an additional 2 years for 2023 and 2024. And then beginning in 2025 through 27, we're all kind of tossed together in this tech neutral clean fuel production credit, which is based on carbon intensity. From our vantage point, it was a mere 3 or 4 years ago before when we were told, hey, it's time to phase out your tax credit, write your own, your obituary kind of thing. So having an opportunity at a clean fuel tax credit that's more permanent, a little bit more predictable, somewhat more predictable is positive, but there's a lot of unknowns. And Geoff and his folks are working through this as everybody is. Suddenly now we have to focus on what's my carbon intensity, how am I going to calculate my tax credit. So we do a lot of work with GREET. We've got a director of environmental science who's working with GREET to ensure that they understand where the carbon is kind of in our industry, and working to make sure that those values are lowered as much as possible so that just regardless of feedstock, we're getting the value out of that tax credit. Another nice feature that does under the clean fuel production credit is it converts the tax credit to a producer credit rather than a blender's credit, which is something that our industry has fought for a long time. Our view is if you're going to use the treasury of American taxpayers to build out a biofuels industry, you know what? It should be done here in the United States, not subsidizing biofuel production in South America or Europe or where have you. So that's a positive development. There's a lot of water that still needs to go under the bridge here in terms of implementation. We're working hard. All the biofuels trades are working hard to make sure Treasury implements this as well as possible so that we come out faring well.
I mean, the extension was good, the production tax credit was good, but it's been $1, now it's a portion of $1. Was that a concern for you guys, or was it also like, well, it could have also been ending? So how did your members feel about that?
That's exactly right. Our kind of strategy heading into this was extend the $1 per gallon that we've lived under for 15 years for as long as possible, provide the longest ramp to the clean fuel production credit as possible so that we can work to improve it, make sure it's implemented properly so that we get the highest value, so that when it is, the law of the land, or when it is implemented, people know what it looks like. We only got 2 years of an extension, followed by just 3 years of a clean fuel production credit. I'm sure there are folks who are probably going to be storming the Hill here in the next couple of weeks trying to get this rewritten. I say good luck. But we'll do what we can to kind of work around the edges to make sure that we come out as well as we can.
Okay, great. So, Brian, we've talked a lot about biofuels policy, but I often hear from my friends north of the border that it's not just the policies and different things, consumers and different things like that. It's just the cost of doing business, and that can be a barrier. I've heard horror stories about environmental permitting times and expense and different things that can put Minnesota plants at a disadvantage. We had a brief period of that in Iowa history. I'm not going to say under who, but so I know a little bit about it. But I think overall we've been pretty blessed with a friendly group that, yes, they want us to comply and do things right for the air and the water and all of that, but let's do it in a common sense, low cost way. Can you share a little bit about your challenges in Minnesota and what you're trying to do?
Yeah, thank you. So I know you had, Minnesotans don't generally like to show emotions a lot, but calling back to your opening remarks, this is one that makes us a little angry. In Minnesota, to get a permit, an air permit, so of the plants in our association, half of them or more have been waiting at least 150 days, and in some cases over 2 years, to update their air permits through the MPCA. So that puts us at a significant disadvantage.
MPCA?
The MPCA.
What's that?
Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. It's our environmental regulator in Minnesota.
I'm an acronym police.
Yeah, it was too much time in DC. But it really, what we're trying to do is show the lost business investment in the state of Minnesota as a result of it. There was a recent news story. There was a soybean crush plant that was proposed to be up in Crookston, Minnesota, that recently they just said, forget this, we're going to go to North Dakota because we can get a permit in 45 days there. So it's really something that I think we're seeing the tangible effects of it in Minnesota right now, and especially we've talked a lot about the Inflation Reduction Act today, and especially in a world where we have the Clean Production Tax Credit, where we have sustainable aviation fuel. We really need to be able to speed up the timeline to permit some of these things in Minnesota, or else we're going to be at a significant disadvantage in our state.
Yeah, I'm worried. Well, you heard my speech this morning, or if you didn't, I'm very concerned about Iowa changing some rules in the middle of the game that could put our ethanol plants at disadvantage. So it makes me feel good to know I'm not alone about challenges on the state level. Because I think the amount of, let's just be honest, the amount of incentives that are going to be put out there through the IRA bill are game changing, and they are going to lead to massive investments. And if you're not positioning yourself to be in a position to make those investments in a timely manner to take advantage of the incentives, you're going to be on the short end of the stick, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's like you've been talking all day about CCS policy too. I mean, it's the kind of thing that if some states decide not to do it, it's going to be you're taking away a significant tool in the toolbox to get to that carbon net zero for ethanol.
So Jake, we're winding down here our last 4 or 5 minutes. So I want to give you a chance to talk about year-round E15. That was something that the governor's staff is still working on, but it started when you were there. Can you tell us about the efforts it took? I don't know if there's any good, well, I'll save that for my wrap-up question. But on this one, we got a bipartisan Midwest group of governors together to talk about it, then to do it, now to follow up and push the administration. Tell us a little bit about that and what you guys did to make that happen.
Well, first of all, Governor Kim Reynolds is going to do everything that she can. As the governor of the #1 corn and ethanol producing state in the country, she's going to do everything that she can to make sure that consumers in Iowa have access to E15 year-round. And we were very excited to see so many other governors across the Midwest, bipartisan, in a bipartisan manner, sign on to our letter, our formal request to the EPA to start the rulemaking process and grant our request so that we can have E15 for sale year-round in Iowa and our collective states. And we're excited to see that there could be a potential federal fix and that this has hopefully helped lead to that. Now, I think we can all guess how the governor feels about the EPA's inaction on her request along with the other governors. So we'll wait and see, I guess, but we've also seen our collective state attorneys general send a letter to the EPA as well, because frankly, what they're doing is against the law.
Yeah, no, we are. I don't think, I don't want to get the cart ahead of the horse, and I'm not the one that makes the decisions, but I will not be surprised if we haven't heard the last from the attorney general's weighing in on this as well. So I want to wrap us up here a little bit. So Geoff, I've got about 5 questions for you, but I'm gonna tee up a couple of possibilities, but I'm gonna actually say, you know what? I probably didn't ask you a question or a topic that you wanted to be asked. So you could talk about the IRFA was very involved with that Midwest governor's effort with technical advice, legal advice. There's IRA tax credits, maybe something else I haven't thought of. Can you take 45 seconds or a minute and tell us, wrap up your presentation?
Sure. Well, I think I'd pick up where Jake left off, and that is, we were so excited and pleased to see this group of 8 Midwest governors come together to create, find a unique and creative solution to this problem. And so, not only did that really generate some movement here in the States, but it also was the catalyst for meaningful discussions about a federal fix. For the first time, I guess since 2005, when the RFS-1 was being negotiated, we sat down at the table with API, the American Petroleum Institute, and they came to us and said, look, we would much prefer, they kind of said, uncle, we would much rather do a nationwide RVP waiver for E15 than have 8 or 10 states in the Midwest doing their own thing, having their own fuel specification. So the governor's effort, and Governor Reynolds specifically, really is what facilitated and sparked that conversation. Now we're in a new Congress. We got to start all over on that process, but that pressure is still there. The refiners do not want to do what the governors are pursuing, and that's why the White House is dragging their feet on this. But that is giving us some pressure and some leverage to really push for that nationwide legislative solution.
Okay, great, and thanks for being here, Geoff. Kurt, I wanted to ask you about SREs, small refinery exemptions, the Fifth Circuit Court. I was going to ask you about the bakers trying to resurrect food versus fuel with soybean oil. one of those, anything else you want to say, take 45 seconds and whatever you want to share at the end here.
Yeah, SREs are important. I don't want to take my time on that, though.
Yeah, whatever you want.
I want to reiterate what our number one priority right now, and that is to get EPA to understand that our industry is trying to deliver $5 billion worth of oilseed crush expansion in the Midwest. That's good for a soybean farmer. It's good for a livestock producer. It's great for our industry that gets additional feedstock. It's awesome for national security, and it's great for the environment when you're delivering 75% less carbon emitting fuels. This is all on a silver platter that we're hoping to deliver to the White House, but for EPA not so far being able to understand what it is our industry is doing right now. So we seek everyone's support in getting that message across to your delegation, your governor. We'll be leading the advocacy effort to hopefully get this right by mid-June.
Okay, great. No, very important. And I would, as we talked earlier, it's not just important for biodiesel and renewable diesel, it's important for all the different categories where things could roll over to. Brian, I already teased you about trying to follow Iowa's footsteps on the E15 access standards. So I won't ask you that. What are some final thoughts? You've been in D.C., you're back in the state. What are any final thoughts that you want to share with our audience here?
No, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to join everybody today. I know Minnesota's been such a leader on biofuel policy, and it's great to come to Iowa, another state that's really doing a lot to push the conversation forward. So just really appreciate the efforts, and looking forward to teaming together more often here going forward.
Well, we very much appreciate that and your willingness to work with us and give us ideas too. Jake, you can either tell us a great behind-the-scenes story on trying to get through the governor's biofuels bill. Names can be left out, but I'd love to hear some dirty secrets, or anything else you want to do to close us out here.
I don't know that we've got a lot of dirty secrets, but we were excited to get that bill done. I know a lot of people in this room that had some kind of behind-the-scenes stories of their interactions with their legislators, whether it's meeting them kind of behind closed doors and shaking them down and saying, you better support this bill, or maybe something a little bit more cordial. But we certainly had our fair share of that, and God, seeing the governor sign that bill into law, and I've got 2 kids and I'm married, and I tell you, that was one of the greatest days of my life. So we're really happy to be a leader in renewable fuel policy, and it's just been a great opportunity to have been a part of that.
That's great. We appreciate it. And I'll just close by thanking you all for being here, thanking Geoff and Kurt and Jake and Brian. We all work together. We have to work together. And I would just say, but there are we try to work together, there are some differences. You can look at Brian and me and our ties. I like your tie, but it might have a few years on it. My dad retired a couple years ago, I mentioned this morning, and gave me all of his ties, and my kids decided that all of his ties were better than all of my ties, so I threw all mine away and kept my dad's, which I'm not sure what that says. Jake left the governor's office and now is out doing his own consulting work. He apparently doesn't have enough clients because he doesn't even have a tie. And to look at these two national guys, those are some sharp ties. I'm a little jealous here. So this is the difference between the national groups and the state groups. And on that, we'll close it out and we'll continue with the agenda. Thank you, guys.